When doing research through archives, I often encounter wills, inheritance documents, and usually there's a list of all the things that people possess when they die. And it's amazing, for most of human history, how little people have. They might have 3 handkerchiefs, maybe 1 chair, maybe a table, and that's about it. Try to compare it to what you probably own. Just go through your closet. 100 different shirts and t-shirts and pants and whatever, and chairs and electronics and everything. Today we're suffering from a glut of too much stuff. How did we go from a life of relative scarcity, which was a lot of human existence for most of the history of human beings, all the way to the glut of things that we have today? The answer is the Industrial Revolution. The last of the great revolutions we will study in this section, along with the Haitian, the French, and the American revolutions. Stay tuned. Je ne veux pas travailler, je ne veux pas déjeuner, je veux seulement oublier, et puis... There are different fields in history. You might study labor history, economic history, political history, military history, intellectual history. Typically, the topics that people find the most boring would be economic history, labor history, and intellectual history, the history of ideas. Well, good news. Today we're going to do all 3. I'll try to keep it interesting. So let's start with the history of ideas and the notions behind the Industrial Revolution, meaning the notion of capitalism. We're all accustomed to the notion of capitalism because we live in capitalist countries. But this was an idea that was not so obvious initially when it first came about. It was reborn in the 18th century. What kind of questions are you asking yourself as an economist? The first one is, how do you set prices? The price of a loaf of bread, for example. Nowadays you're thinking, well, just go to the store and through supply and demand, that's how the price is set. But that was not an obvious idea. If you had lived in Europe in the Middle Ages, typically the price of bread would be based on the notion of the fair price. And that goes back to Thomas Aquinas, one of the great thinkers from the period. And he thought that bread was such an important staple of people's diet that you had to make it affordable to everybody. So you could not let the price of bread go too high. On the other hand, you had to make sure that the farmers made a living by having enough price for the grain that they sold. And same thing, the baker that transformed the flour into bread also had to make a living. So in practice, you would have an official price where a loaf of bread would be, I don't know, $2. This was a way to make it fair to the producer so that they would have enough of an income, but also not too expensive to the customer so that they could purchase things. This made prices quite predictable, but also a bit problematic when there would be, say, a bread shortage, and then all of a sudden there would be a big pressure to bring the prices up, and you were not allowed legally to do it. Another question for economists is, how do you get your laborers? Which was an issue for most of human existence because there were few of us around on Earth. Today there are 7 billion of us, not so much 1,000 or 2,000 years before. So laborers were few. And labor was also hard because there was little mechanization. So how do you secure enough laborers to do something where you're going to pay people little to work? Slavery is something you find in just about every society, including Europe throughout, say, the Roman period, into part of the Middle Ages, and then in the colonies of the Caribbean that were owned by the Europeans up until the 19th century. Or in Europe, you had systems like serfdom, a semi-free labor system. Yet another question, how do you regulate trade? If you have a surplus, who do you sell it to? What are the rules for that? Up until the 18th century, the norm in Europe was mercantilism, meaning that you try to regulate trade quite a bit in order to limit the imports from other countries and to expand the number of exports to other countries. And if you bought little from others and sold them quite a bit, in that case, you would run a balance that was positive, a surplus of trade, which would have to be paid off through bullion, like gold and silver. In that case, you would accumulate those reserves. And the thought was of trade as being a zero-sum game, that the more that you got, the less as others did. European countries might acquire colonies in the New World. This way they could produce things like sugarcane or coffee that could not be produced in Europe, and thus have to rely on imports from other countries less. And in those colonies, we would also try to regulate trade to prevent those colonies from trading with other countries, again, the idea being to run a surplus. Another question for economists is, how do you set up businesses? Norm was to have a very regulated kind of system, where to set up a business, you would have a special charter from the king, which was kind of difficult to have. And once you had that charter, that might give you a monopoly on, say, trade to the Indies. Or if you wanted to be a baker in town, again, nobody could set up the business as a baker unless they were part of the guild. The guild would be that association of bakers or whatever crafts that you have. And in order to be a part of that guild, you had to be an apprentice to a master, and you had to be accepted as an apprentice, and then you would become a master. So altogether, it was a world of regulations. All this changed in the 18th century when you have the period of the Enlightenment. The key figure in that case was a man called Adam Smith, who has an unremarkable name. In fact, a lot of people don't know him, even though he is one of the key thinkers of the past few hundred years. He created the capitalist world in which we live. He was from Scotland, and he was the author of The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. So how do you find laborers? Do you have serfdom? Do you have slavery? Adam Smith said no, just have free labor. Anybody can work if they want to, and the only way that will motivate them will be a salary. If you have too many workers and you have unemployment, just lower the wages. And through a process of supply and demand, the supply of labor, the number of workers, will match the demand for labor, the number of jobs out there. What about how you set the price for goods, like a loaf of bread? Well, just complete freedom. People, if the price of bread is pretty high, will get into business and start producing more, to the point where there will be a glut on the market of loaves of bread, and then the price will naturally come down. If it gets so low that people can afford bread very easily, then they'll buy a whole bunch of bread and the price will go up. And if there's any kind of disruption, like say a grain shortage due to a poor harvest, well, the price of bread will just skyrocket for a moment. And some people might get hungry, but ultimately the price will come down next year when you have a better harvest. What about the notion of trade? Well, in that case, free trade, freedom everywhere. You can let open any barrier to trade, any restriction, any kind of tariff that you have on imports and exports, and just let people trade the way they want. If Jamaica has a British colony, well, they don't have to trade exclusively with Britain. They can trade with other countries if they prefer to. Freedom of trade. This was studied not just by Adam Smith, but another great classic economist of the period. His name was David Ricardo. The classic example that he gave there was about trade between Britain, England, and Portugal. Normally, under the mercantilist system, every country tried to produce everything so as to import as little as possible. So the British, for example, might produce wine so that they could drink and use it for mass. Except that Britain does not have a very good climate for wine, does not have a good tradition of winemaking, so they make bad wine. What about Portugal? Well, they're very good at making wine, and they have the right climate for it. However, they're not too industrialized in the 18th century, so they're not too good at making textile. So if you eliminate all the trade barriers, each country will specialize in what is called the item where they have a comparative advantage, where they're good at. For the British, they're good at making textile in an industrial fashion. The Portuguese are good at making wine. So the British should just quit making wine altogether, make more textile than they need, and export the surplus to Portugal, and with whatever money they make from that trade, then they will import goods, in that case, wine, from Portugal. And the brilliant idea from that is that if you calculate how much you can buy with those exports, altogether you have a higher income by just making the stuff that you're good at and importing the rest than if you try to do everything and live in autarky. Not just the British, but also the Portuguese. And so trade would go from being a zero-sum game when you try to run a surplus at the expense of everybody else to a win-win situation where everybody, by being specialists in their area of comparative advantage, would benefit from free trade. What about how you set up businesses? Well, again, complete freedom. If you want to be a baker, be a baker. If you want to create an LLC or some kind of charter, you don't need the king to agree to that. Everybody can jump in. It's a free-for-all. This was an idea that was extremely simple, but also radical. For absolute monarchies, this was very threatening. You let people do whatever they want. Well, if you don't control them, and then that might lead to complete chaos. The genius idea from Adam Smith, however, is that the whole system would be self-regulating. That you would have a hidden hand, they call that, as if there was some invisible hand behind the scenes, constantly adjusting prices. And minute by minute, through a million decisions, by individual workers going on the job market and employers setting wages, then the price of the wage, the price of labor, would be set at the optimum price. Same thing with the price of a loaf of bread. In all the stores, in all the kingdoms, they would be immediately at the ultimate price without anybody trying to regulate things. A hidden hand. Almost magical in how it would operate. This is also known by a French term, laissez-faire, meaning just like people do as they want, and ultimately the output will be greater. So the notion of supply and demand, free enterprise, free labor, free trade, all these notions are radical. Each of them would be enough to make Adam Smith one of the great thinkers of all times. But he also came up with another idea, the notion of the division of labor. Again, let's compare what came before and what came after. Before, most industrial processes were based on fairly small mom-and-pop operations. If you want to make textile, for example, you would have a special guild member who would operate within his shop, maybe with his family helping around, and with one specific loom. And they would make every step of the process, from making the wool, turning into yarn, and then weaving, and then cutting, and then doing the tailoring process. You might have one person doing every step. Adam Smith said, well, let's do something different where we have every person in charge of just one step. And the example that he took was how to make pins, little metallic pins like the kind that you would use in your hair. Instead of having one specialized craftsman do every step of the process, you would have, 20 different steps and 20 people doing every single step. So one of them would just be measuring. Another one would be sharpening the end of the pin. And by dividing the process into those tiny bits, you would avoid wasting time by changing tools all the time. You have one person instead who does the exact same thing all day long. And because they're just doing one thing that's very simple all day long, they'll get very good at it. So the productivity will go much higher. And that's the beauty of the division of labor, as this became known, that you can use somebody just off the street with very little training. You can make them very good at a very simple process, and their productivity will be higher than if you had a much more educated craftsman who knew how to make every step of the process, but he would waste time going from tool to tool. That is essentially the process that we have everywhere. If you go to, the Ford Motor Company, the way they make pickup trucks is to have one person doing just one step of the process. A bit like Charlie Chaplin in modern times in the 1920s, the assembly line process. This goes back all the way to Adam Smith. Aside from Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the third great thinker from the period was Malthus, M-A-L-T-H-U-S. His main claim to fame is connected to the notion of the iron law of wages. Here's the idea. He noticed that if you have a population that is growing, it will tend to grow exponentially, meaning that if everybody has 5 kids and all these 5 kids will have 5 kids of their own, the population will go from 1 million to 5 million to 20 million to 100 million in just a few generations, an exponential growth. However, the supply of food to feed all these people tends to grow more slowly, meaning that it might grow up by 2%, 3% every year. So in year 1, you have 1 million bushels of rice, and then the next year you have 1.02 million bushels of rice, and just a slow growth. Which means that within a generation or two, you might have a big gap between the amount of food that is produced, that has just grown slowly, and the population that has ballooned. If that would happen, then mass starvation would ensue, and so forth. What did that mean for economics? Well, it had to do with how you set wages. Many people would want to create a wage, a minimum wage that is higher than what the market would normally bear, as a way to help the laborers get a better wage, something above the subsistence wage, for example. But Malthus warned, if you start paying the workers too well, then they'll buy a lot of food and then start having a lot of kids, and the population will explode, and ultimately this is not sustainable. You will have war, famine, and pestilence. So that was a justification for not setting a minimum wage, that the wages would be set at the subsistence level, just barely enough to have a roof over your head, some food in the stomach, and some clothes on your back. Any more than that, and the workers would start multiplying like rabbits. Any less than that, and they would start dying like flies. Alright, enough with the boring topic of intellectual history, now let's move on to the boring topic of economic history, specifically how those ideas by Adam Smith were put in practice in England in the 18th and 19th centuries, what we know as the Industrial Revolution, the big takeoff of that country to economic prominence. Why England specifically? Well, we know it because with 20/20 hindsight, we know where the history unfolded. If you had looked at a map or a graph of the GDP of the world around that time, and GDP stands for gross domestic product, how much a country produces, in 15, 16, 1700s, the largest economies in the world were India and were China. They were not Britain. And whatever gap you had between richer countries and poorer countries might be very small, maybe a ratio of 2:1. The GDP per capita, how much each person produced, was remarkably similar all around the world because people were mostly farmers or low-level craftsmen producing things with low levels of technology in kind of the same way all around the world. Now fast forward all the way to the present time, and the gap in the GDP per capita between a rich country and a poor country might be now a ratio of 100:1. A very poor country would have a GDP per capita of $500 per person. A rich one would have a GDP per capita of $50,000 per person. So how do we go from point A to point B? What allowed that economic takeoff? And why in England specifically rather than India or China? Well, there were a number of things that were preconditions for economic takeoffs in Britain. For one thing, economic theory. David Ricardo, Malthus, Adam Smith, all of them came from England or Scotland. So the idea is already there. But you also need things like capital. Capitalism is based on capital, and that means money, money to invest. Britain had accumulated some of that money, usually through trade. So by early successful ventures into trade in the pre-modern age, Britain had accumulated some capital that then would be reinvested in the industrial processes. This is also a kind of snowball effect when you start by having a bit of money, which you reinvest, and then you can be reinvesting more and more and more and more over 100 years. Ultimately, you have enough to do greater investments like railroads and so forth. Beyond capital, what you need is labor. You need workers, a population that is large enough. One thing that happened in the 16 and 1700s in Britain was the enclosure movement. Initially, in the countryside in Britain, you would have a bunch of land that was open to everybody. It might be owned by a private person, but there were no fences, so people that had no land might bring in their sheep or their cow and then use that as public pasture. It would be like the commons. This allowed very poor people who had no land to kind of barely survive by having a cow or two or something. By the 1700s, you have a phenomenon called the enclosure movement, whereas rich people in Britain put up fence enclosures all around their pasture, mostly because this way they could grow some sheep there, and with the growing textile industry, there was a market for all that wool. The effect of that was to prevent poor people from making a bare living in the countryside, which was terrible for them and forced them, under the risk of starvation, to move to the big cities to look for a job there. There, they would then be prime material for the Industrial Revolution because these are your workers in the cities that you can employ at a very low wage. A terrible situation for them, but if you're a businessman, well, that sounds exciting. Plenty of workers. What about the population overall? Well, the population of Britain really skyrocketed in the 17 and 1800s. It's connected to a number of factors. One of them that we already studied, the Columbian Exchange in the Caribbean in the 1500s. And remember that the number of crops from the Americas, potatoes, tomatoes, corn, are introduced in Europe after the discovery of the New World and allowed Europeans to have a much more diverse diet in the 15, 16, 1700s. And as a result, the population went up. Try to imagine Ireland without the potato, for example. Well, the potato was introduced from Peru. Beyond that, there's also progress in medical knowledge in the 1700s, 1800s. That is a time when medicine went from being a quackery to being a proper science like it is today. One of the first discoveries was this notion that you would have vaccination, or inoculation is how they called it in the 1700s. That if you were exposed to a weakened version of a virus, or a closely related one from an animal, then your body will acquire immunity against it, and then when the real thing hits you, you're able to fight back. This was done with smallpox initially in the 1700s, and eventually all the vaccines were discovered. Nowadays there are some weirdos, and quite a few of them, who think that vaccines are bad for you and they don't want to be vaccinated. I would like to put them in a time capsule, and send them back 300 years to a time where of 5 kids that you might have, one would die of polio and one of measles and one of smallpox. Also of the great discoveries would be those made by Louis Pasteur in the 1850s, 1670s, and 80s in France. Pasteur is the one who studied microbiology. Generally, people thought that life appeared out of nowhere before Louis Pasteur. That you would have a piece of meat and all of a sudden discover with flies, oh, it's all rotten. And that just happened. People might even think that if you had a pile of old fabrics and so forth in an attic, at some point mice would spring out of nowhere. Life had a way of self-generating. Well, Louis Pasteur, by looking through the microscope and through studies, discovered no, life does not come from nowhere. It comes from things that are microscopic. We can't see it, but it's there. And that had important implications. That, for example, if you want to allow food to last longer, well, maybe sterilize that food to begin with by maybe cooking it very high and killing all that microbial life, and then keep it in the darkness, away from contact from air, maybe in a cool environment. Whatever germs that you're trying to fight off will not develop very fast. You all know that process. It's pasteurized milk. You just boil the milk and then keep it in an airtight container in the fridge, and it will last much, much longer than if you just had a bottle of milk lying around somewhere on the counter. This would have a huge consequences in terms of medicine. Initially, when people would do things like amputating a limb, they would use the same tool that they had before and had used for another patient, and so they would be filled with germs. So people might survive the amputation. It might be painful without anesthetics, but people would survive that. And then after that, they would die 3 days later of an infection. Or a woman, instead of delivering babies at home, would try to do it in the hospital with a doctor, thinking it would be better. And then doctors would use dirty instruments that they had used with other patients, and then you would die at higher rates in a hospital with a proper doctor in the 19th century before Louis Pasteur than if you had done things in a very low-tech way at home. That completely changed when Pasteur came around and doctors learned things like washing their hands. Another thing that people died of a lot before the 19th century was just bad water. If you lived in a big city like London or Paris in the 19th century, the main river going through it, like the Thames or the Seine River, was often the place from which you got your water, for drinking water. At least poor people did. There was no good sanitation, so that river was also the main sewage system where all the bad water, including from poop and such, would end up with. So think of it as pretty much drinking from your toilet. That's what people did. If any one person in the city has a kind of problem that is gastrointestinal, like diarrhea or any kind of disease of that nature, then it will pass into the drinking water and everybody will get it. A very big problem in the 19th century was cholera. You had several epidemics of cholera in London and Paris in the 19th century until people finally realized we need to have better cleaning water. And so they started tapping water from the springs way upstream and bringing clean water to the city, running water, and then discovered that you need to build a sewage system and then dump your water pretty far downstream or just clean it before you put it back into the river. It's amazing, but up until the late 19th century, most big cities in the world were not self-sustaining by natural growth. It's only with the discovery of sanitation and vaccination and better water that finally the cities could grow by natural means. It became safe to live in the big city. So if you add up all that, vaccination, better food supply, better water supply, pasteurization and so forth, the population of Europe started ballooning in the 19th century, especially that of Britain. When you're a demographer, you often do a graph called the demographic transition. On the y-axis, you put things like how big your population is, your birth rate, and your death rate. When you start from a pre-modern society, like say Europe in, 1300, you usually have a society where the death rate is extremely high because people don't have vaccinations, so they die in childbirth, they die in young age, they die of bad water, they die of all these reasons, or starvation, and so you have a very high death rate. At the same time, people have a ton of kids because they don't have contraception, and also they know that to have a decent chance of survival, you need to have a lot of kids. Very high death rate, very high birth rate. As a result, the population tends to be stagnant. It might go up 1 year, and then the next year around, a famine will hit, or the Black Death epidemic will hit, or some major war will hit. It will just kind of seesaw with the population being low and generally stagnant over the long run. Then the 19th century happens, and with all the progress that I've just described, the death rate starts to plummet, where people have a good chance of living to the age of 20, 30, 40, 50, or 60, and most kids will now survive to adulthood. It takes a while, though, for people to adjust their birth rate. People keep having 7 or 8 kids per woman, even though by now 5 or 6 or maybe all of them will survive to adulthood. After a generation or 2 or 3, people realize that most of their kids will survive to adulthood, and that's not necessary to have 7 kids anymore. Contraception is also introduced, so women decide that now they only want maybe 2 or 3 kids per woman, and then finally the birth rate and the death rate start to match up again, and then the population stabilizes at a much higher level than when you started with. The period in between is where the population skyrocketed. This is called the demographic transition, when you go from one spot to the other. And many of these countries, like Britain, undergo the demographic transition during the period of the Industrial Revolution. Another graph you might encounter if you do demographics is called the age pyramid. It works like that. On the x-axis, you put the number of men and women, and the y-axis to the top is the different generations, young and so forth. So in a pre-modern society, like say 1400 Europe, you would have a pyramid with a very large base because people have a lot of boys and girls. And they die pretty young, so the pyramid narrows down quite quickly and doesn't go too high because very few people go to the age of 60 and above. During the demographic transition, the birth rate remains quite high, but now people are standing a good chance of living to a late age, and so the middle part of the pyramid bulks up, and you also have more people at the tip. If you get to a more modern society, like say the US today, the base of the pyramid is much narrower because people have fewer kids, and then it's kind of straight because most of those kids tend to go all the way to adulthood, and then the tip is quite high because most people will live fairly long. Or even in some societies, like say Italy or Japan today, people have very few kids, maybe 1.5 per woman, so you have a very narrow base. And you have a pyramid that's almost inverted, where you have a big bulk in the middle, very few kids, and an aging population at the top. If that happens to you, then your retirement system is in trouble. So England had the capital needed, and they had plenty of laborers. What else do you need? Well, you need raw materials. Most of the Industrial Revolution was about making steel and textile. For steel, you need 2 things, iron ore and coal, and there Britain was kind of lucky in that it had both in abundance. Other countries that also went through the Industrial Revolution quite quickly, like Belgium, like Germany, like Northern France, like the US later on, also had those raw materials. In that case, it's just a matter of geological luck. For textiles, you would either need wool or cotton as the primary material. England had plenty of sheep, especially after the enclosure movement, so they had the wool. Cotton does not grow in England, the climate is not favorable for that. But the British were able to acquire that cotton either by having colonies of their own or by trading with free countries like, say, the United States after independence, or having semi-independent protectorates like Egypt. Eventually, India also played a big role as a supplier of cotton. So through trade, Britain had all the ingredients that it needed for the Industrial Revolution. Once you produce all these goods, you also need to transport them. England, being a set of islands, had easy access to the sea, so that does help you. You're not a landlocked country. Most of the countries that took off had some access to the sea. You also need a good internal system of rivers, the Thames and so forth, or the Rhine River in the case of mainland Europe. And if you don't have those, well, you might build canals. Beyond that, the big invention of the Industrial Revolution would be the railroads, which is mostly a British invention, and would allow much faster and cheaper transportation. So whatever goods you have get transported to the destination, the markets in the cities at a way that is much cheaper and faster. Eventually, with the invention of the steam engine, you can also have ships that are powered by steam, will go faster again to the destination. Finally, beyond labor and all these things, you need greater productivity year by year. And the way to obtain that, to produce more with the same amount of labor and capital, is to have more scientific processes of doing things. For example, inventing the steam engine. There are different inventors that are responsible for this or that bit of the steam engine, but James Watt from Britain is the one that usually gets credit. Making steel was also crucial. People had known how to make steel since, well, forever. There's such a thing as the Iron Age in the ancient times, but this was a slow, cumbersome process. By the 19th century, there's a new process, again originated in Britain, called the Bessemer process. And I'm no chemist, so don't ask me to explain how it works, but apparently it's a better way of making steel in large quantities. So now instead of having steel that is rare and expensive, enough to make a sword but no more, now you have plentiful steel, enough to make entire railroad tracks or entire buildings. Beyond that, you'd have a lot of machines, shuttles, flying shuttles, all sorts of tiny incremental processes that would allow you to go from the mom and pop operation with one loom, one family working in their own home, to a huge factory where a single person might operate 50 or 100 looms at the same time. What is the result of all these inventions? Well, you have a soaring output. For most of human existence, GDP growth had been kind of slow. You might have a good year with a good harvest, and the next year you had a bad harvest. So altogether, the GDP per capita, how much wealth you had, was pretty much the same. The average peasant living in, I don't know, ancient Greece, 500 BCE, probably lived just as well as the average peasant living in Britain in 1500. That would have been 2,000 years later. Not much progress over those 2 millennia. From the time of the Industrial Revolution, you start having about 2-3% economic growth per year. And if you do that decade after decade after decade, through the magic of compounded interest, your economy will double, and then double again, and then double again. And you have a new phenomenon whereby a new generation of people will live much better than their previous generation of parents did. That seems obvious to us today, but that was a radical development in the field of human history. Also of important consequence was the fact that some countries went through the Industrial Revolution and others did not. England from 1750 or thereabout was the first to undergo that process, and then Belgium, Northern France, Germany, later the US would follow along in the 19th century. But many other countries did not. China did not. India did not. Why they failed to do so? We'll have some videos about that. That would have a huge impact on the history of the world, because now some countries like Britain would have the technological expertise and the wealth needed to colonize a good chunk of the world. And we'll have a whole video on 19th century imperialism, but spoiler alert, the British, the French, and Belgium end up conquering a good chunk of Africa and South and Southeast Asia, because they are the rich kids on the block. This phenomenon altogether is known as the rise of the West. What other consequence do you get? Well, it changes the way laborers live. Nowadays, instead of being workers on your own farm in the countryside, you are more likely than not going to be a blue-collar worker in a large factory in a big city. But also with less control of your life. Instead of deciding, I want to go to work early this morning or not at all, because it's my own farm, now you have to follow the clock. You have to go to work at 7:45 a.m. sharp, otherwise you get a fine. Everything is now controlled by others. Now everything is regimented by the clock and also now the electric light. Instead of working on your own loom where you decide whether to work faster or not quite as fast, now you have to follow the rhythm of the machine, because you are now a slave to the machine in a way, where you have to follow the pace that is set by the foreman. You used to be a master craftsman that did the entire process of making metal pins by yourself, and you could break the product. Now, through the assembly line process, you're just responsible for a tiny, tiny portion of the overall process. Sure, it's more productive, but you don't recognize yourself in the finished product. So at the same time, the overall countries would get richer, the working class would suffer some plight. This eventually gave rise to the communist movement. There are different communist thinkers. Some of them are French, like say Charles Fourier or Joseph Proudhon, but the most famous of them was German, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, his colleague, the author of the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and then later on the various volume of Das Kapital, The Capital. We'll have a whole bunch of videos about that, because that notion would rise to the fore in the 20th century in Russia, in China, and be a major rival to the notion of free market democracy. So there it is. We did a bit of economic history, labor history, intellectual history. That wasn't too painful, right? Well, here is one last task for you. Go to your closet, look at all the millions of shoes that are lining up there, and a big mess because you have so much stuff in there. And if you ask yourself, why? How did I accumulate so much junk? Now you know the culprit, Adam Smith. He's the one who made you so rich. Je ne veux pas travailler. Je